Welcome to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus. We're studying tonight the book of Acts, chapter 25. We've studied Paul in conflict with Jewish leadership throughout his career as a missionary. And now in the last couple chapters and this, we see him in courtroom scenes, one after another after another. First we saw Paul and Felix. Before that we saw Paul with Lysias. Now we see Paul with Festus. And next we're going to see him with Agrippa. So some governors and a king. Governors and a king. I remember those words being used in some prophecy by Yeshua. In Matthew chapter 10, Yeshua said, "They will bring you before governors and kings. I'll give you the Holy Spirit will give you the words to say. Don't be afraid. Don't worry. The Holy Spirit will give you the words." And so that is no doubt in Paul's mind. He's not afraid when he's brought in front of big shots. And that is a good encouragement to us who are less noble and less capable than Paul to be not worried when people stand in front of us at the office or in the neighborhood or in the family and they deride us or seek to ambush us either physically or mentally or spiritually. Not to be afraid. And so Paul, never afraid and ever willing to testify both of the Lord, His word, His power, His reality of resurrection, stood up. He did what he had to do. Let me give you some clarity on who's who. There are so many kings, and especially Herods, it could be confusing. Let me give you a little bit of history if I can. Herod the Great was the one who killed babies. You remember him? Yeah. The birth of Yeshua. He had a son named Herod Antipas. Antipas was the one who killed John the Baptist, the one who got married wrong, killed John the Baptist. He had another son, Herod the Great did, named King Agrippa the First. Agrippa the First is the son of Herod the Great. Agrippa the First is the one who had James killed in chapter 12. And a couple other things. He's the one who imprisoned Peter and who was eaten by worms. We read that in chapter 12 of the book of Acts. So Agrippa the First, this was around 44 AD or CE as modern usage.
And who is this Agrippa?
Okay, this is Agrippa the Second. That's the one we're looking at now. He was born about 27 AD. His official name is Marcus Julius Agrippa. And he did all kinds of great things, as most noble kings did. He changed the name Caesarea Philippi. We recognize that from several biblical references. He changed the name to Neronius in honor of Emperor Nero. And that's what you did. You changed the name. And we still do that in modern days. We change the names of certain streets to somebody who's just died or we want to honor. That's very common. Now, Agrippa the First, Agrippa the Second's daddy, had a brother named Herod. It's like they ran out of names. Who was the king of Chalcis. He died around 48 AD. That king, Agrippa's uncle, our Agrippa in this story, chapter 25, his uncle, Herod, was married to Bernice, whom we're going to see in the story. Bernice is also Agrippa the Second's sister. So he's his uncle and he's his brother-in-law. That's not uncommon, but it's just weird. Okay? Agrippa the Second is brother of Bernice. He's also brother of Drusilla. You remember that name from last week? Felix's wife. The Jewish wife. That's right. These are all Jews. They're just mixed. So we lose a little bit of their Jewishness. Yeah.
But he was Idumean extraction.
Idumean. Edom was Esau's name. And Idumean means he had enough Jewishness in him to say, I've got good Jewish yichus, but I'm not going to live like a Jew. All right, let me tell you a little more about Bernice. She was the wife of Herod, the uncle of Agrippa, right? Herod, the king of Chalcis. She was the lover of Vespasian and Titus. Vespasian, you know the name?
Yeah.
Titus, you know the name?
They both destroyed the
That's right, Roman emperors. So she got her way into all kinds of bedchambers and government palaces. She is the sister of Agrippa II. We get introduced to them here in verse 13. King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea. We don't know that she's Queen Bernice. There are stories out there that are legend that they had incestuous relationship, which wouldn't surprise us knowing her trampedness. She's been out there a lot. All right. Paul has experienced his conflict with the Sanhedrin in chapter 23. He had his conflict or judgment in front of Felix in chapter 24. He was accused and then he defended himself in chapter 24. Then there was a 2-year detention. Now tonight, chapter 25, we pick it up again, Paul and Festus, again with some Jewish accusation, and then from verse 6, Paul's defense. So it's the same story again and again, but there's different players. And the reasons are abundant that Luke would have recorded all of these episodes. One, to show Paul's courage under fire, under every bit of fire. Secondly, to show all the different places where he could have been, how shall we say, acquitted. He could have been acquitted and then gone back to work on his 4th missionary journey or something. But for some reason, he had a dream to get to Rome. He longed to go to Rome. This was God's mechanism to get him to Rome. As a Roman citizen, Paul would have known the law. As a smart man, he really knew the law. And appealing to Caesar, as we see him doing in this chapter, is a guarantee to get a high court. All right, so that's a kind of big picture. Now let's go back and look at the smaller picture.
Did Paul, when he appealed to Caesar, did he ever think that he would have to go to Rome?
He knew he was going to go to Rome.
He knew that. That's why he appealed to
That's
Caesar.
correct. If you watch the tennis on Channel 7 and watch the Australian Open, they have Hawkeye. Hawkeye is a great electronic eye by which a player can appeal to a higher court than the chair umpire. The linesman calls the ball out or good, and the opponent of the player who's just struck can challenge the call of the linesman. He appeals to a higher authority. Not even the chair umpire. He appeals to somebody higher, this electronic eye called Hawkeye. Now, if you're in the middle of a point, and it's a ferocious point as these people are hitting like crazy there, 150, 190, 200K an hour. I mean, brilliant speeds and so accurate. And they hit the ball, and you have a split second both to return the ball from, say, your baseline and to appeal in case you think the call which was not called should have been an out call. Last night, Djokovic did that to his own almost demise in the 4th set, as he made an appeal when he didn't have to, and the ball, he would have been able to just carry on. Well, he ended up winning the set. We don't need to worry about it, but I just want you to know that Paul knew what he was doing when he appealed to Caesar, as Djokovic would have known to when he appealed to Hawkeye. This time is about 50 AD. That's what time we're looking at. And Nero is well and truly in power as emperor of Rome.
So when you are talking about being king of Agrippa, he just only has a tiny kingdom.
Provincial kingdom.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so there were little, we would call them later fiefdoms. Hard to call Tyre and Sidon kingdoms. Northeast Israel was the section that Agrippa II, oversaw. And he comes over to the Mediterranean here to Caesarea to pay respects to a neighboring governor, proconsul, really to secure favor. Verse 1, Festus, therefore, having arrived in the province, this is after Felix, who was only there 2 years, flew out. 3 days later went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And that's what you do when you take over governorship over Judea, is you go to the capital. Not the Roman capital that's there in Caesarea, but the Jewish capital, to make sure that you've got good oversight over these folks who are the principal folk there, the Jewish people. Chief priests, leading men of the Jews, brought charges against Paul. See, in the midst of a state visit, you don't expect a particular case to be brought up. Here's Festus. Pontius Festus comes in, and he expects to be met by the chief men, the prominent folks, have a social gathering like we see at the end of chapter 25. Royal robes, greetings, banquets. I'd like you to meet my cousin. He's a journalist for the Jerusalem Post, like this. And that's it, a schmooze fest. That's what he expects. What does he get? He gets this particular case brought up. It doesn't make sense. It is true, but it doesn't make sense. In light of state visits, they brought charges. They were urging him, requesting. So here's the meeting, but they are doing more than handshaking. They are very intent on still ridding the Jewish world of the Apostle Paul.
Even after 2 years,
That's right.
he was in prison, they still brought that grudge against.
Oh, it is the number one issue. You'd think there'd be other things like, say, could we get a Roman aqueduct down here to Jerusalem? We're in it's a drought. Maybe water, maybe global warming was a matter to them, maybe food for the poor. You'd think there'd be something that would be number one. Could we get a ship? Could we get a tourist visa to go up to Rome for a holiday? No. Cyprus? No. Their number one issue that Luke reports is that they want a concession against Paul and that he might be brought up to Jerusalem. And again, the reminder about the ambush that they still had in place. We saw it a couple chapters ago, this 40-man ambush. Now it's probably been modified, of course, but the ambush plan was still in place. Festus, clever, indecisive, but clever, says, no, I think I'll keep him back in Caesarea. I smell a rat. And I don't think there's something right here. I appreciate it. Look, I'm just pounding flesh. I'm just making good on my promises. If I'm elected governor, I'll come around and say hi. But don't give me your malarkey here. I'm not going to bow to your pressure. But, tell you what, if there's something wrong, then, you have a trial, you have a justice system here. Verse 5, you let the influential men among you go there with me to Caesarea. And if there's anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him. In other words, do this in a court of law. He is Roman, and the courts of law were prominent. Now, this is an embarrassment to anyone who knows the 7 laws of the sons of Noah. Have you heard the phrase? Have you read it in the Bible? It's not in the Bible. There's nothing about the 7 laws of the sons of Noah, though the rabbis will tout it to this day.
Rules for the Gentiles.
Right. And where is that in the Bible?
I couldn't find
It's not in there. So if there's a law, 7 laws for the Gentile nations, you'd think it'd be in there. But it's not in there. But they've codified them plenty, and they hand out flyers about them on the streets of Bondi Junction and on Carlisle Street, Balaclava. And they want Gentiles to keep the 7 laws. And they are things like don't murder and establish courts, and no idolatry. Establish courts. Now, see, that would be a good thing if you're in Singapore or you are in Sri Lanka and they don't have a system of courts. That would be a great thing. So here came the Roman Empire with its great talons as they traveled the globe and established Roman courts. This is great. And I think in light of the modern understanding of the 7 laws, that this is an embarrassment to Jewish people. We who had the laws, 613, we who had the 10 Commandments, we who had the understanding of God and justice and mercy and righteousness, we are told by Festus, bring some of your top guys with you, and if there's anything wrong, have a court. In other words, don't do this in the ambush sense, don't do this in the cowboy and western sense. Do this properly. Now, if there is such a thing as the 7 laws of the sons of Noah at that time, which I don't know if there is, then what a shame this is on the Jews who are running the show at that time, that they don't even establish a court of justice, but are trying to do an ambush. You see the irony in this. After he'd spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them, which is a funny number, he went down to Caesarea. I thought Caesarea was north. How do you go down to something north?
Because he went out from Jerusalem.
That's right. So we're talking topographically, not cartographically. They didn't have maps like we had maps. Maps weren't as developed as... He took his seat on the tribunal, and that's really a governor's seat, and you see it in every amphitheater and judicial courtroom and judicial palace of the Roman Empire. there is a seat for Caesar and his representative. And he ordered Paul to be brought. After he'd arrived, after Paul came in, the Jews who'd come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing, you just get this sense of ambush even there in a court of law. This surround, almost a mob gathering. Watch one guy run down a soccer pitch and watch his opponents gather around him, or an AFL ground, and one guy's trying to go in and score a goal. It's crazy how he is surrounded, and that's really what's happening here. Poor Paul. So the Jews came down, stood around him, bringing, you get an action sense, many and serious charges against him which they couldn't prove. That's Luke's commentary. But you get a sense that they're not doing it in order and decency. And even if there were, it's trumped up charges. And we see them in his defense in verse 8. Basically, he just gives them the back of his hand saying, no, I'm not against the law, I'm not against the temple, and I'm not against Caesar. I'm not a seditious person. I'm not an anti-religion person. Well, I don't know what they're saying, but it's not true. There's no evidence of saying, I've already given that evidence, that non-evidence to Felix. I've given it to Lysias, Claudius Lysias. Now I'm giving it to you. There is no such thing. But he doesn't really, you don't hear their charges. You only hear his defense, which is one line, which is not much of a defense either. That's the funny phrase there in verse 8. The law of the Jews. It's the law of the Talmud. That's it. The law of the Jews. And he said, even that I've maintained. The law of the Jews. Maybe he's saying, look, the Judeans, about whom we're talking, you're the governor of the Judeans. I've not broken any of their laws. So rest assured, I'm not going to break your law. You might hear it that way. But I find it a funny phrase. And when you see something in the Bible that doesn't match any other place, you got to wonder why it's said that way. Because it should be the law of God or the law of Moses. The phrase is not used anywhere else in the Bible. It's always used as the law of Moses or the law of God. Therefore, the question is, when it's called the law of God, it was never for the Gentiles. It was for the Jews. It was the law of God. So it's not about application. The law of Moses, that makes sense. But no, law of the Jews. There's one in one of the Gospels where they refer to the Passover of the Jews instead of the Lord's Passover. Again, a funny turn of phrase. And when you see those, you just wonder, ponder, what else is he saying? What might be inferred? Festus, who wanted to do the Jews a favor, and really, Festus is a wishy-washy guy. He did make a stand against the Jewish leadership down in Jerusalem, up in Jerusalem, sorry. And now he is saying, I need to curry some favor with them. He said, hey, you want to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before those guys down there? You know, you're going to stand trial before me. I'll go down. I'll go to Jerusalem. But shouldn't we do this there in front of the Jews? He said, and that's not a thing you'd give a prisoner an opportunity. Where would you like to be tried? You know, make a decision, Festus. You're the boss. So that's why I think he's a little wishy-washy. Paul said, no, I'm standing here in front of Caesar's tribunal. Be a man. Suck it up. You're the prominent fellow in town, you know. If Caesar were here, I'd hang with him. I've done no wrong to the Jews, and also you know very well. So if I am a wrongdoer, and I've committed anything worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. In fact, tell you what, I appeal to Caesar. I'm not going south to Jerusalem. I'm going north to Rome. That's it. I appeal to Caesar. I think he's almost talking himself into it. At that point, he could have just said, when Festus said, would you like to go up to Jerusalem to stand trial? He could have said, no, thanks. And just left it right there in Caesarea. But he didn't. And like Djokovic, he appealed quickly. Maybe he didn't need to, but he did. He appealed to Caesar. And maybe if you understand the courage of Paul, you know he's not afraid. If you understand how he's dealt with other governors and leaders and authorities before, he sees Festus as a wimp. He thinks Festus might dob Paul in to the Jewish leadership, and he might lose his own life. So knowing what's in people, he appeals to somebody who's not afraid of people, Caesar, even though it's Nero. When Festus had conferred with his council, he said, yep, well, okay. It's sort of like a template. You've appealed to Caesar you shall go. This is the council, probably a legal advice council, and this was the statement in response to that official request. Much like you would get a letter from the Queen when you turn 100. much like you would get an official reply from something in Canberra. I sent a couple letters to people over the last month in government and have gotten official replies. Sort of like your call is important to us. We will deal with it. We will respond to you if necessary within a few days or weeks or whatever. It's an official boilerplate letter. It comes from a government agency. That's what this was. So that's the end of Paul and Festus in the trial. That's it. I mean, that's pretty thin. We didn't hear Paul's lengthy explanation of things. So after several days, then in comes King Agrippa and his sister Bernice. They arrive back here at Caesarea and pay their respects to Festus. This is that government handshake, another state visit from the official king over in the east coming here to the west. While they were spending many days there, which means royal activities, lots of happenings, streets are a mess, they're closed off because of state visit, Festus had a little conversation with him. I get a picture in verse 14 that it wasn't the first thing that Festus wanted to bring up with Agrippa, whereas when Festus went up to Jerusalem, it was the first thing that the Jewish leadership wanted to bring up with Festus. I think by showing the juxtaposition of these two state visits, Luke is showing us the diminution of the concern in Festus over against the concern within the Jewish community. When somebody comes, I had a federal senator come here yesterday, and we had a nice chat for an hour or so, hour and a half. And we talked about various things. He's from Victoria, serves in Canberra, was up in Sydney for a couple days, probably watching fireworks. No, he had other things to do. And he wanted to make sure he had a visit with me. I'd never met the man before. He is not Jewish, raised Roman Catholic, very pro-Israel, very supportive of the Jewish people, not only because he serves down in a Melbourne district that's pretty Jewish, but also his own heart is there, and it's beautiful. And we talked at great length about evangelism and about sharing the gospel. And I wanted to get a couple things in during our chat. I only got one in, and it was just a little thing that we talked about, and it brought nothing to pass. But had we spent many days together, as we see here in verse 14, then both of the concerns I had would have been brought up. He had a concern. It was his appointment. He called me. We had our conversation. He had his agenda, and that was fine. If you're spending many days with people, if you're on a P&O cruise, you'll have time to see and schmooze with people many times. There are times when I play golf with folks, and always during the course of the 4 hours you're together, at least, maybe 5, maybe 6, then you'll have time during that time to talk about a lot of things. And I always bring up the gospel. Would you call yourself a Christian man? Is there something going on in your life that God's trying to get your attention about? Things like that. I'm always trying to hear the spiritual condition of the fellows with whom I play. And you can do that. Now, if I rocked up on them at the pro shop at the beginning of the round and said, hello, I'm Bob, I'm a Jew for Jesus, are you spiritually minded? That might be a little off-putting, but over the course of many hours, you got time, trust, relationship already. It's there. So I think that's what's happening here with Festus and Agrippa in verse 14. They were spending many days there. Festus laid Paul's case before the king. There's a man here. Felix left him. Yeah, that's a good opportunity. Don't say he's your prisoner, that you've actually left there too, but this is Felix. Felix is left over. I was at Jerusalem. All these Jewish guys brought charges against him. They asked for condemnation. I answered, well, Roman custom isn't for us to do this until we meet the accuser face to face, make his defense, so I brought him up here. And we assembled here. I made no delay. You hear that in verse 17? Over against the end of verse 14. I made no delay. Felix made a lot of delay. So, hey, I'm pretty good. Again, I think a waffler needs that for his own self-affirmation. But on the next day, took my seat on the tribunal, ordered the men to be brought. When the accusers stood by, they began bringing charges against him. Not of such crime as I was expecting. What was he expecting? What are the crimes? Yeah. Inciting rebellion, stirring up antagonism to government. There were insurrections on a regular basis. Remember the Egyptian that they had already thought that Paul was, who had stirred up 40 men earlier to do damage and ruin all around Jerusalem. So I thought he was that guy. Well, he wasn't that guy. And all he did was talk about some fellow who was alive, and they said he was dead. I mean, who cares? This is Festus in, no doubt, drunken conversation with Agrippa and Bernice. I didn't know how to investigate these matters. Verse 20. We saw this earlier, that when you wanted to do investigation, what did you use? We don't call it investigation in modern days. Yeah, the whip. We call it interrogation and waterboarding and whips and shooting somebody's kneecap and all these things you see on Jack Bauer and 24 and CSI and NCIS and all these Law and Order. Modern interrogation methods and old interrogation methods are very similar, even though there's the Geneva Convention and how one is allowed to be as a prisoner of war. People do what they want to do when they want to get information out of people. And when we read the words here about investigate, remember we saw that already when they wanted to investigate the apostle, they whipped him. That's interrogation. It's a softer word. I like in verse 19, as Festus is relating the story of Paul, what does he know about the Christian message?
That Jesus was dead is now alive.
That's the gospel. That's what Festus knows. Paul has made it clear that he's standing there, I'm on trial for the resurrection of the dead. Jesus rose from the dead. You know, when people want to know what you believe in, they don't want a 5-minute story. They want a sound bite. You got to give them a sound bite. I had a lady stop in this afternoon here at the bookstore, and she was also raised Catholic and wanted to know what was with Jews for Jesus. Had you seen our website? She said yes, but it was a little confusing. I said, let me make it really simple. We're Jews. We believe in Jesus. He's our Savior, and He needs to be yours. And that's really it. End of the day, that's what we want people to believe. You don't have to be Jewish to believe in Jesus, but if you are, believe, and if you're not, believe. I mean, the point is, get people to think about Jesus, not about Jews for Jesus. We're not Jews for Christianity, trying to represent an age-old religion. We're not into another ism. We're into a Savior who died and rose from the dead for us.
But it's a contradiction, Jews for Jesus.
Okay, to some, because they think in terms of religion. We are Jewish people who've discovered the Jewish Messiah foretold by Jewish prophets in the Jewish scriptures, and that He died and rose again to give us new life. What will you do with that? You know, that's where you go with it. Always focus on the person of Jesus rather than what our religion is, or, you know, most of the time people just want to know where do you all meet? Yeah. And we say, we're not a meeting hall. We're not a church. We are Jewish people who believe in Jesus. And who do you think Jesus is? I mean, that's the next question. Quickly get to that. We'll see Paul with Agrippa next week as he gets him almost persuaded. But I like that. Festus knows the gospel is about the risen Savior. He doesn't know about his own failure as a person. He doesn't know his own sin. He doesn't know God's love. He doesn't know a whole lot of things, but he knows that it's focused on this. A dead guy is alive. At least that's the story. Festus in verse 21 says, well, I was getting ready to work this out, and Paul appealed for the emperor's decision. I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. Self-stroking. It's pretty full on. Agrippa said, I'd like to hear this man too. Tomorrow, Festus says, I'll work that out for you. I can organize that. Leave it with me. You shall hear him. So, next day, Agrippa came together with Bernice with great pomp. You got to love that in verse 23. This is a person who knows how to make pageantry. They're wearing royal robes. They're eating royal foods. You can hear the trumpets. You can see a Cecil B. DeMille movie unpacking, you know, with hundreds and hundreds of extras queuing and forming a line as here comes the great King Agrippa, who's not that great, and his tawdry wife, Bernice, had entered the auditorium accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city. This is the cue. This is a parade, a festive parade. It's beautiful. At the command of Festus, so he's at the front. And then comes Paul. I love that. Look at verse 23. Paul was brought in. Can you get the picture? It's hard for us because it's just words. But imagine the scene. Royal robes, prominent people, crowns, scepters, horses, trumpets, people shouting, hoorays. And here comes this little Jew with some chains on, his hands maybe his feet, in a scruffy robe, unkempt maybe carrying a scroll with him, a little tiny scroll, pocket New Testament. But can you see the comparison is shocking between pomp and under the circumstance. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen. I mean, this is so full of stateliness. You behold this man. Doesn't even get his name mentioned. When you hear this kind of off-putting, this man, back of the hand, about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring he ought not to live any longer. But I found out, because I'm a good judge, I'm a prominent guy, I'm like you, I'm pretty somebody. I found out he wasn't really worthy of death, and then he appealed to Caesar, to the emperor, so I decided to send him. He is so up himself. Yet, and here's my trouble, I don't know what to do. I can't send him to Caesar because there are no charges. You don't send a guy up for an appeal case. You can't have an appellate court if the lower court didn't have a decision. There's no decision because there's no charges. So now we've got to figure out what charges to make. I brought him here before you all, and especially before you. Somebody, King Agrippa, please fill it out so that after you investigate, in other words, you do the interrogation, I may have something to write. Because it seems absurd to send up a prisoner and not to indicate charges because there aren't any, because he's not worthy of any problem. See? But Festus is making himself look really good. Agrippa, we need you. So Agrippa is going to talk in chapter 26, and we're going to see Paul with Agrippa. Again, another courtroom scene, another royal scene. And Paul's going to have a lot more to say next week than he did tonight. He just had one line tonight, not even worth writing a script for.
You've been listening to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus in Australia. For more information, contact us at Jews for Jesus, Post Office Box 925, Sydney, Australia, 2001. God bless you.